Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Once again, I'm joined by Abigail Tracy, journalist and veteran of places like Inc., Forbes, and Vanity Fair. Today, she is coming to us from the great state of Minnesota. Abby, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Abby, today I want to get, Abby's perspective on a couple of things. I want to start with the you started your career as a business reporter. And as we've seen in the last couple of days, the CEO of United Healthcare was gunned down, I would say in broad daylight, but it was before dawn, outside a hotel in New York City by I'm going to call an assassin, a person who was laying in wait, clearly knew what they were doing. As a retired NYPD officer said, the gun jammed, but he knew how to clear the jam and finish the job, and then knew exactly where he was going, to get on an e-bike and head into Central Park, where it would be very difficult to find him. I assume there are not nearly as many CCTVs, everything else. So the first part I want to talk about is, in your experience, what is going on in the C-suite of a company like United Healthcare or other companies, and then what's going on in the C-suites of big, gigantic, ginormous semi-monopolies all over the country, because I have to assume that like security companies' phones are ringing off the hook this morning.
Yeah, no, I think you're certainly right on that point. Obviously, it's still kind of early in the investigation. We assume the motive, might be tied to his actual role at United Healthcare. I guess it is a question mark. But something like this, I think absolutely is going to send shockwaves through any C-suite at the moment. I think, even when we think back to some of the kind of big changes that we've seen in leadership, whether it happened during, the Me Too era, you saw like a number of, CEOs and CFOs kind of taken down, sort of in that process. And the rebuilding and sort of filling those roles, it was difficult.
Right.
It throws everything into disarray. So I think that's just like when we're looking at a general leadership change, the fact that this man was gunned down and very likely, as you put it, by an assassin, it was like, sounds like a real serious hit. I think that that is absolutely probably terrifying CEOs across the country, particularly of, my characterization, kind of like evil corporations,
Mm-hmm.
healthcare companies, um, banks probably. I just think that there is going to be some fear. And just the fact that this happened in daylight in New York City, just on the
Right.
street, is
Right. If it was a mob
crazy.
hit, we would call it brazen, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Paul Castellano getting, offed outside Sparks Steakhouse by John Gotti's crew, right?
Right.
But just right on the sidewalk, I think it was at Seventh Avenue. Is that what the hotel on Seventh Avenue? In Midtown, right? Abby,
Hmm.
like this wasn't tucked down on First Avenue or in some cubby hole of a neighborhood, right? It was like
Right.
this is a major thoroughfare in New York City, and the Hilton is a major hotel. I'm sure I have done events there. I'm sure I might have even stayed there. So,
Hmm.
this is not exactly, again, an out of the way place. This is the heart of Manhattan.
Yeah. And I think, one of the real kind of scary things when we're looking at this is, to your point, like that's crazy. Like it sounds like it's made up. Like it sounds as though
Mhm.
it could be in a movie or a TV show, not like real life. And so I think too, then kind of like back to this C-suite idea, there really isn't a playbook for this, right? Like there isn't a like, I mean, they'll probably lean on the existing hierarchy within United Healthcare, but it isn't like a normal retirement or anything. Like there is
Right.
no playbook for, the head of your company getting gunned down in New York City. So,
No, and as someone who's been on the crisis communication side of something like, say, the BP oil spill, right? There
mhm,
is some crisis PR firm that is going to make an outrageous amount of money, helping them through this because, whoever their in-house people aren't at all probably prepared, nor, as to your point, would anybody be. But there will be a payday for some firm that's trying to figure out how to do this. And as I said, And to your point about whether or not it's healthcare companies, banks, again, the demand for private security will probably go through the roof, which, from a social perspective, clearly, this gentleman, if you're the CEO of one of the biggest healthcare companies in the country, a company with a 32% denial rate on its claims, right? He was not personally feeling the bite of those people being denied. And, just to turn this from a business thing to a social thing, Abby, as I've flipped through social media, there is there is no sympathy for this guy. This gentleman was gunned down, shot in the back, shot in the leg, probably shot more than that, left to die on the street in New York City as the gunman got away. Wife, family, all that. To your point, like who knows, extended friends, extended all this. And like people are like, well, maybe if you didn't run a healthcare company that denied all these claims, these things wouldn't happen. I saw one video of a woman, pretending to be a claims adjuster in heaven as this gentleman
Oh.
gets to heaven, and she's like, "Sorry,
Mhm.
you're denied, right? Because having a back is a pre-existing condition." And so for me, like I've got no love for health insurance companies, and I don't know that
Mhm.
anybody could. Um,
Right.
I got no love for big corporations generally, but I don't like big to begin with. But it's a little, even for me in this time, it's pretty raw. It's pretty rough out there that like this man is dead. And everybody's like,
Mhm.
haha, not everybody, but a lot of people. I mean, what do you think's going on?
Yeah, I think that, when we are kind of looking at like society and kind of back to like the idea of like corporations that people do find evil, I really do believe that healthcare is just like right at the tippy top. So I'm not entirely surprised by the fact that there isn't an outpouring of sympathy, but I
Right.
do think like to your point, there's kind of this idea that this is an actual human being whose life is now taken.
Yeah.
Th- With a family, he is not the embodiment of the US healthcare system. You know what I mean? Like it is like, yes, he was running this massive company, and yes, that had all these like these incredibly high rates of claims, but it is still like a stunning development. And just sort of the reaction being like, meh, had it coming is very calloused, I think, for anybody, um, whatever their job may be.
Well, and I mean, look, I know that, having experience, as we all do, if we've been lucky enough to have regular insurance for any amount of time, is, the one thing about this industry is like you have to be your own advocate, right? They're not going to do anything to help you out.
Mhm.
If you get, let's say, let's just keep the numbers simple. If you get a $500 bill for, whatever it was, and you think it's outrageous, and you call them, you actually spend the 45 minutes or an hour on the phone to actually get through to somebody. You say, I'm not paying $500. They're like, okay, well, how about 250? And we're like, okay, I'll pay 250. But that in and of itself, Abby, like the arbitrary nature of like we sent you a bill for $500,
Right.
right? But like, who the hell knows what it really was?
Right.
Right. I had a friend who got sick in Mexico earlier in the year, right? Spent 3 days in a hospital, a brand new hospital. And I think it was like, $1,800 cash for 3 days, medicine, all the other x-rays, all the whole thing. Came back, had to go spend like half an hour in the emergency room here in the US. And it was the same thing. It was $1,800, right? So it's like, um, so that's one of those things where it's not just that, to your point, like there's a callous nature, but maybe it's the reflection of, okay, yeah, no one should be murdered. That's not good. But also, is the bureaucratized automaton of a United Healthcare callous in the way that it operates, which is, oh yeah, you're approved for the surgery, but we're not going to approve the anesthesia, or the idea that so many of them.
Right.
And there's a great podcast series by a guy named what the hell's his name? Robert Evans, on Behind the Bastards, about the fact that like healthcare companies know that fraud and abuse is riven within their systems, but more often than not, they'd have to admit that there was fraud and abuse in the systems. So
Right.
they just basically tell those people not to do it or to pay the money back, and then they just jack rates to cover for it, as opposed to shutting down people who got fake social security cards or fake provider numbers or whatever it is, and are just billing the hell out of whatever and getting paid. But again, it's sort of like, well, we could go after these people, but that means we'd have to have this whole fraud and abuse department, which I'm sure on some level they do. But that's the thing, is like, is it a place where you see the callous nature of a company that big saying, this might put you in the poorhouse. We don't care. And now
Yeah.
the reflection is, this guy, you're right, maybe he was not personally the embodiment of United Healthcare, but again, the body politic is like, I will,
Right. Well,
how many lives did he ruin? And again,
right.
I should never condone murder, nor should we condone poor people going bankrupt because they needed
Right.
gallbladder surgery.
hmm Well, and to your point too, like dealing with insurance companies, like the flaws and the gaps in the system are part of the business model. Like that is how it works. That's how they make money
Right.
because it is clunky, because it is difficult, because it's not easy, and because, people do have to pay so much and are likely getting overcharged or, not able or willing to like take the time to, dispute a medical bill. I mean, my sister, she's dealing with getting on insurance right now, and it's a nightmare. And
Mm-hmm.
it's been a nightmare for, it's been like an absolute ordeal to do so. It's the flaws in the system are the system, if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, and this is one of those where, I'm sort of, I don't know, philosophically, I don't like big concentrations of power anywhere. But I mean, the other part too is that the health insurance industry is a highly regulated industry. Um, and these are the things that the regulations allow. So, like, you could, if you're a regulator, make changes, right?
Mhm.
You could say, no, you're going to systematize your billing. You're gonna automate this stuff. It's going to be, here's how. Because if you're a for-profit healthcare company making several $100 billion in profit, right? And look, you've got shareholders or whatever. I get it, but at the same time, like, you know, where is the line, right? And I think that's what an event like this, to me, brings into focus for me. I can't speak for anybody else. Is like, this guy was so angry, and let's just assume it was based on a claim, right? Just because,
Mhm.
with no other information,
Right.
right? Maybe it was a wife, a kid, a parent, whatever it was, that he was driven to take lethal action against someone because he was so upset. How many people have, you know, hung up the phone and screamed, "I'd kill those people." Right?
Mhm.
Have thrown their phone across the room, have looked at a bill and said, "There's no possible way I can pay this." And again, I think that's part of the thing where, just to dip my toe into populist politics for just a second, Abby, and I promise I'll move on, is when you have a guy like Donald Trump saying the system is rigged and it's screwing you, people are like, it is. Of course,
Right.
the big trick, the Wizard of Oz trick, is that he ain't going to change it, right? He's not going to fix it, even though fixing it would be the ultimate disruption to a status quo that is clearly leaving a lot of people in the lurch, from a financial and a medical perspective.
Mhm. Right, right. Yeah, it is yeah, it is so difficult just to like unpack it. And again, I think sort of back to just the brazenness and the message it's sending. Like it is a message. Like this is not um yeah, it just
Right,
daylight, Midtown, New York City.
right. Well, and I think the other, probably, follow on effect of this is that there will be, think to your point about, succession plans and all these other things at big companies. You could make an argument that a lot of these CEOs will now say, I'm not taking the job without personal security. I'm not taking the job if I have to fly commercial. I'm not
hmm
taking the job if you don't, have a two-car motorcade for me, right? And I think that the practical and psychological result of that will be that the CEO of a major healthcare company will feel even more disconnected from their customers. The customer will feel even more disconnected from, their provider. And that you could see this seeping into, like, what if now every United States senator and every member of the U.S. House of Representatives or every member of every state legislature now says, you know what, I want a Capitol cop,
Right.
right? I want a state trooper, right? And then that creates a literal physical barrier between, a constituent or a customer and someone providing, service politically or service from a business perspective. And again, that's one where I think, again, the outrageous nature of the act is probably, and again, to whom it was inflicted on is, I think, driving a lot of the attention. But I think it starts, to your point, like to start spider webbing out into all of these other things. And I would imagine that, there's probably several thousand FBI agents who are considering retirement who could probably pick up pretty good business as a private security consultant for corporate America in the coming days. So, we'll see what happens. The gentleman clearly, the man, I shouldn't call him a gentleman. Clearly, wasn't a gentleman. He shot somebody in the back, but the man clearly, again, had a plan, carried out that plan, and now, I mean, you used to live in New York, right? There's like 6 bridges off of Manhattan, right? The manhunt alone, will be, he's already off Manhattan, right? And then once he's
Yeah.
off the island, God knows where he is. Okay, let me switch gears a little bit, but I want to stay in your perspective now, not as a business journalist, but as a political journalist, Abby.
Mhm.
So, David Frum, who is the editor of The Atlantic, went on Morning Joe on MSNBC the other day and made a crack about Pete Hegseth, the former, I think he was in the Army, Army veteran, Fox News personality, apparently liked to drink on the job, does not treat women well. Even his mother said so, and has been nominated to be Secretary of Defense by Donald Trump. Frum went on Morning Joe and made a remark about the fact, that this guy, like if something like if at Fox News he was drunk, like how could anybody else tell? Something like that. We'll put the article in the show notes. He is escorted offset, and when they come back from commercial, Mika Brzezinski reads this basically apology to Fox News, saying, we disagree with Fox News, but we respect our colleagues over there, all this other stuff. To which Frum responded with a post that, like, what are you doing? Right?
Mhm.
Like, really? Like, it
Right.
wasn't defamatory, right? There was nothing, illegal about what he said. But again, it goes to this further capitulation that I think had already begun, even prior to the election amongst many members of the media. But, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski seem to be the brightest, furthest, leaning forward people in this. And so I want to get that part of it, and then I want to talk about this other thing that Scarborough did, I think, this morning. So as a political reporter, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with reporting in the time of Trump?
I think it's a really good question, and I don't know that anybody's figured it out. I think, when we look back at 2016, and when we were reporting around it, obviously there was this uh, obsession with covering him, and
Mm-hmm.
sort of, but it was driven by this belief that he wasn't a serious candidate
Right.
and that that it was never going to happen, and kind of just like, the notion of here's this reality star and all that. Um, and then, and that backfired massively. He got, all this earned media in so many ways that I think really played a role in his election in 2016, just because he was this character and sort of, you know, one of the things people say is, um, he's not a serious person, but you have to take him seriously. And I think that was obviously a huge miscalculation by the media back in 2016. I
Right.
think what was really interesting was, fast forward to after 2020, Trump was, he wasn't on Twitter or X, formerly
Yeah.
Twitter, now. He wasn't on it, he was doing his weird thing, selling NFTs and all of that craziness, and
Baseball
just kind of
cards,
like,
right? Yeah.
right, and just like kind of like yelling and ranting on Truth Social.
Mhm.
And I think actually like the media handled it well at the time, because he was the former president. Like he was saying ridiculous things, and it was like they kind of cut off like the attention spigot
Yeah.
in a way that I think was really beneficial. And then, obviously fast forward, Republican, the Republican primary happens. He obviously wins it, and then you have the election, and so the ground shifted again. And you can't ignore him in that way. But I think like one of the things to really start as a member of the media, I think people are debating this. Like these conversations are happening in the media. Like, how do we cover another Trump term? Like we're just weeks into the transition, and already there's craziness, in the who's being named to what people are saying,
Right.
all of the above. And I think like one of the keys that I've sort of heard from folks is sort of this idea of cover what he actually does, not
Mhm.
necessarily everything he says. Because obviously there are certain things that he's going to say that are going to be controversial. That's who he is. Bombast is his thing. And certainly like if he makes certain remarks or there is rhetoric that like comes out, some of it is going to be worth covering because it is the president,
Right.
and naturally, like inherently, things that they say do like really do matter. But I do think that it's what is going to be very key, especially when he's kind of surrounding himself with this, you know, clown car of like cabinet secretaries and administration and members of his administration. I think really focusing on what is actually happening and like
Yeah.
what actions are being taken, because I think even when we look back at his first administration and his first term, there was a lot of coverage around, again, the things that he was saying. And I think a lot of the things that the administration was actually doing that were detrimental to the country or did really impact the lives of, Americans were being missed
Mhm.
because like the Trump show was still being
Right.
broadcast everywhere. So I think there needs to be a real kind of reckoning within the media on focusing on, okay, what is actually happening? Like what is happening in these agencies? Like what role is, RFK Jr. actually playing and, guiding the health of the country? Like, what is Kash Patel doing at the FBI? Like, these are really important things that we need to pay attention to because these are, these nominations will have a critical impact on the country and sort of the future of it. And we have to be paying attention to what the administration writ large is doing, not just what Donald Trump is saying, because also
Right.
he says a lot of stuff that
Right. Just for effect. But I mean, that's the thing. So this Pete Hegseth who from, was sort of ushered off camera for making a remark about, like, he's in line to be Secretary of Defense. Is he going to be Secretary of Defense? Give him at less than a 50-50 shot. But now they've already said, well, they're thinking about Ron DeSantis as a replacement, which, like, I don't know if that's better or worse. It might be worse because here's the other part. Yes, cabinet secretaries can matter, especially when they are pseudo celebrities like
Mhm.
Bobby Kennedy Jr. But the truth is like, if Donald Trump and his White House want to purge all of the 2, 3, and 4-star generals that they don't believe are, somewhat loyal or in line with his view of the world, like, that's going to happen no matter what, whether or not it's Secretary Pete Hegseth or Secretary
Right.
Ron DeSantis, right? And the if Kash Patel doesn't get confirmed as FBI director, which again I could make an argument isn't going to happen, they'll find somebody. But again, the outcome is likely the same, which is there's a policy that these guys want to implement. Now, look, even with the bureaucracy and the guardrails as damaged as there is some immune response that will probably slow things down a little bit. There will be infighting amongst the MAGA types that will create some friction to action. But the truth is like, yeah, these people are going to do what they want to do. But again, look, the direction comes from the White House, right? Very,
Right.
very rarely does a cabinet secretary go out and do what they want. Like, the guy who's going to be Secretary of Energy or who's been nominated to be Secretary of Energy, he's like a big fracking guy from Texas, right? You know, I've asked around because I've got some friends who are in that business down in Texas. They seem to think he's like, you look, he's an oil god. There's no question about it, but he doesn't seem to be crazy, right? Which is relatively speaking, I guess okay comparatively, unless you're, not a fan of the fossil fuel industry, which I can understand why. Back to evil corporations, but like a lot of these things, are going to be Trump and the Project 2025 goons and everybody else around him that wants these things to happen, plus his allies in the House and the allies in the Senate. So I think you're right, which is like, let's see what happens on day one, right? If
Hmm.
they start rounding people up, then we're going to know where we
Right.
are.
Hmm.
But so let me get back to the studio of Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. So this morning, and again, I'll include the clip. Scarborough went on a bit of a rant, or I'm going to call it a tantrum, Abby,
Hmm.
about the fact that yes, he went and met with Trump, and people have called him a fascist, but he's met with other leaders, and he's gotten grief for what America is doing or what America has said, and like, but I do all of it for you. I do it so that I can bring information to you. And like, to me, that was, that was megalomania, right? Like, okay, you've been around a long time. You're feted by everybody. You've got a morning show that's been very popular, but like, since you went to meet with Trump, not, I mean, not just, not just their show, but I mean, MSNBC and CNN's ratings have fallen through the floor, right? But this is one of those things, Abby, where I've had friends who went from part-time TV people to full-time TV people,
Hmm.
and it's like they, when they're part-time, they have two distinct personalities. I think probably like we all act differently on the air, right? Like if I know, like I'm going to be on, as we're recording this, I'm going to be on Stephanie Rule tonight. Okay, I probably got 6 minutes on the air, which means I've got 2.5 minutes to talk. They'll tell me what they want to talk about. I'll come up with whatever it is I'm going to say, right? But like, when I turn my laptop off, like I don't continue talking in 2.5 minute sound bites to the people around the house,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
But then when people get deeper into that like Klieg light studio culture, like there's only one personality left, and it's the on-air personality, right?
Hmm.
And they act as if like, well, I'm on TV, so I must know everything, right? And a lot of people say, well, he's on TV, so he must know everything. And so that was the sense I got from watching Scarborough was like, they made a decision they were either told they had to make to go make peace with Trump, or they felt like for their own professional and personal well-being they had to make. And now they're getting blowback for it. And because he's been so popular for so long, like he's really upset that people are mad at him and he doesn't think they have the right. But to me, again, between the, apologizing to Fox News, the bending of the knee to Trump, and now this like, you don't know who I am, or you don't have the right to be mad at me. It just seems like they're rapidly, if not already, transforming into what I'd call the controlled opposition, which is they'll be able to criticize up to a point. And then if they feel like they've crossed a line, right, they're going to do what they did with Fox, which is they're going to apologize on air, which think about a year ago, right, would be unheard of at MSNBC, right? There would have been riots in the studio. There would have been riots in the halls at 30 Rock about the idea that, wait, you're apologizing to Fox News? So give me the sense of like, Klieg-like culture.
Yeah, like it's strange. I think the apology was strange. I don't know that it was necessary, or at least I don't think it, I think the comment could have been more casually addressed on the
Mhm.
show. I don't think it needed to be this like breaking news apology kind of moment.
Right. They made a bigger
Um,
thing out of it than it would have otherwise been.
yeah,
Yeah.
like I think you could have just pushed back like as people do when they're on, round tables and
Yeah.
things of that nature, just kind of undercut the comment in real time versus like make it into this bigger thing. So I do
Hmm.
think like, unforced error a little bit there to like turn it into this thing. And then obviously then you got, the follow-up from and all of this afterwards. So it became a thing when I think nobody would have really picked up on it or noticed, or they could have just, sort of addressed it and let it go. So I think that was, a bit of a mistake there. In terms of like I think like one of the hard things with Morning Joe in particular and Trump is look, he is the president-elect. Like, at end of the day, like he's going to be in the White House. Like it does matter. It does matter, for any journalists to have sources in the White House to be engaging
Hmm.
with, the Trump team, Trump administration officials, and potentially Trump himself. But I think like one of the difficult things around like Morning Joe in particular is they they present a little bit more as like opinion hosts than reporters in my
Yeah.
mind. Obviously they
Hmm.
do their reporting, but they aren't necessarily like a Caitlin Collins, so to
Right.
speak, or
They're
something
not
like that.
correspondents. Right.
Right. So it's like they are kind of more, I think of them a little bit more almost like opinion writers, the
Hmm.
equivalent of opinion writers, but on TV. And so one of the things then when we're looking at that is like over the last years, they've made kind of being anti-Trump a part of their brand. And so I think the reaction, sort of this strong reaction to it, has been a result of uh it's been a result of them, doing a I think it's been more a result of the fact like this is their brand and this is sort of like what they built up.
Yeah.
And then so people are like, whoa, 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 like you guys have been criticizing this guy. You've kind of positioned yourself in opposition to him. And so I think it's less about like, I think people generally can understand, the need as journalists, whether you're on TV, whether you're a reporter
Hmm.
writing, um, the need to like engage with the incoming administration and the president. But the thing with them is like it undercut their own brand that they've created around Trump as a figure and their treatment of Trump that I think people were like, ding, 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 hypocritical. And like that was the problem. And then when you factor in Scarborough's rant, it was very like, I do this for you. Like, why do you not appreciate me? Like,
Right.
it was very strange. Like, I think you could have, I think the argument to be made is like, no, it's important to engage with, you know, this administration, with this president. And I think full stop, that's all you really needed to say. Whereas like his reaction, it felt more like he was personally aggrieved than
Right.
like professionally explaining.
Yeah, and yes, I think that's right. Let's go back though to like 2015 and 2016. Remember, they had Trump on all the time
Mhm.
when they thought that there was no possible way A, he could be the Republican nominee, and then B, no possible way he could win,
Right.
right? Because what does he do? He hoovers up numbers, he hoovers up eyeballs, he drives clicks, he drives viewers. And they were perfectly happy to take that when it there was no to them there was no real cost to it,
Right.
right? Then he takes office and they decide, okay, this is where we're going to be. um, and then he's out of office and this is where they're going to be. So it's really, they haven't done a 180, they've done a 360. They've come back to frankly where they started. Now, does
Right.
that mean that they're going to fet Donald Trump and hope to have him, oh, Mr. President? Maybe they will. Because that's the other part too, is that like once you've made the deal with the devil, it's not like he stops asking for things,
Mhm.
right? They're going to be like,
Right.
one day, what happens if like the lower press office calls and they're like, hey, yeah, I'm calling from the White House. The president would love to appear with Joe and Mika tomorrow morning at 7:15 a.m. Do you guys have time for him? Like, are they going to say no? They're not going to say no. They're going to say yes, right? And they're not going to stop him from saying whatever crazy thing he's going to say, right? And that's where, again, they're betwixt and between. Like the vampire's bitten you now, right? You invited
Mhm.
him back into the house. You finally got him out. You invited him back in. Like he's not going anywhere. And that to me is the thing. And like there was something like Joe Rogan said, well, maybe I'll apply for a White House press pass. To give him one in a heartbeat. Right? Every
Right.
podcast, every right wing podcast will have a seat in the briefing room. As ridiculous as that might seem to you and me, like that will be the reality. Because that's where, remember that the Trump people are not worried about convincing you or me, Abby. They're worried about
Mhm.
keeping their own people informed and creating enough of a sort of like, fuzz on the radar screen of sort of the American, electorate that the things that are getting the most and the best attention are the ones that are reaching the most people. And, like cable news doesn't really reach many people. It doesn't.
Hmm.
Newspapers are reaching less people every day. And these are the places where people are getting their not even news, but this is where they're getting their information. And like a buddy of mine and I were having lunch yesterday, and he was talking about this is a guy who was not a Trump supporter in any possible ways. Like, but I was listening to Joe Rogan and Matthew McConaughey talking about how they cook steaks. Like that's the beginning, right? Like
Hmm.
that's the entry point. And then before you know, like, oh yeah, he is pretty entertaining. And it's not going to be 100% Donald Trump is great. It's not even going to be 10% that. It's just going to be 5% of reorienting people's brains to a place where they're willing to accept more and more of that stuff from a Rogan type, from those kinds of people, because, at
Right.
least they're entertaining, right? Like they don't make fun of me. They don't talk down to me. They don't tell
Hmm.
me, look how much I do for you, right?
Right.
Like, right? Like, and they're all rich. That's the other part too. Is like all these guys, especially Joe and Mika, like that's the other part. Like, not for nothing. Like they don't need the money. Like they
Right.
don't need the money, but they can't give up the seats at the table, right? God forbid. Like they could have made a decision, Abby, that said we're going to retire. That's it. Write books, do a speaking tour, whatever it is. But if the choice is between having to deal with him in a legitimate way when we don't believe the things he does are good for the country, good for democracy, whatever, right? So we're going to step aside, or we're going to come up with, well, he might be a fascist, but I've got to talk to the fascists. Like they couldn't give it up. They couldn't give up
Hmm.
morning television, and
Yeah.
that's not surprising. That's sort of human nature. But again, like there's no heroes in this.
Right. Right. Yeah. And again, I think both things, the from moment and then the subsequent um reaction to criticism of seeing Trump, I think they just made him into bigger things than they needed to be. Like and I think again that's sort of an unforced error where it's like we're talking about it now because they made them into bigger issues than they
Right.
perhaps needed to be.
Right. Well, and I think that's, just to stick on MSNBC for a second, which I am going to appear on tonight, at least based on this recording, I will. I'm not sure if I'll actually be on it tonight. But, when there was the story about, Comcast might be spinning it out, and Elon Musk sort of mused, well, maybe I'll buy it. Right. And Rachel Maddow, who's got a very successful show and is very well thought of, is very smart, is sort of like almost teary eyed on the air. Like, well, see, like this is why they don't worry about you, because you could have gone on the air and said, absolutely not. I will find the people to get together and match any offer he makes, right?
Mhm.
As opposed to, oh my God, can you imagine him buying MSNBC when, like, I don't know how many people watch it on a daily basis. It can't be that many, right? Compared to whatever, strongest man competition from Sweden circa 1984 is running on some channel somewhere, or the guy shooting wild hogs on the Outdoor Network. Like, I mean, these are not big numbers, all things considered, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah, it's all fascinating.
it's all
But
fascinating,
it
and we
but it's
will.
also like Groundhog
Right,
Day.
exactly. Yes, it's Groundhog Day, except that the groundhog has now taken methamphetamine and ketamine, so you have no idea what Puxatawny Phil is going to do other than try and chew people's
Right,
faces off.
right.
All right. Well, Abby, what, if anything else, do you see on the horizon? What's if you're looking at the news, if you're looking at the world, you're there in Minnesota. Is there anything you're seeing that you feel like the folks here at the home front should just give a second to think about?
You know, it just feels like there's a lot. There's a lot happening. I do think people should be paying attention to um, what we're really seeing from uh, Republicans in the House and in the Senate,
Hmm.
particularly as they react um, to some of these appointments and these nominees. I think, you know, we've already sort of seen shifting of goalposts, seen kind of, obviously not very many profiles in courage. Obviously, Matt Gates's nomination was tanked, but we're not necessarily seeing the same kind of pushback to other like troubling appointees, such as,
Right.
Kash Patel or even Hegseth. Like there
Right.
is some around Hegseth, but like, it's kind of watching. the Republican Party already sort of glom onto Trump and kind of fall right back in line and right back in step with him. And I think it'll be very interesting to sort of see how these nominations roll out and play out, because I think it'll be a portent of what else is to come
Right.
in the administration, particularly in terms of, opposition to some of the more troubling things that he's pitched on the campaign trail. And then over in the House, the numbers aren't looking great for Republicans after the election in California. So,
I think it's 217, 215. So yeah, I mean, no one can be absent from school for the Republican
mhm.
conference, right? Everybody's got to have perfect attendance until they get, I think it's three more, red district special elections done sometime between February and April. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So it'll be yeah, it kind of interesting to watch how it all plays out. But I think particularly, look, like Donald Trump is not an anomaly anymore. He is
Right.
the standard bearer of the party, and he has been. And, you know, he's walking in with what he claims is a massive mandate. I'm not sure, I'm not going to define or kind of put
Right.
limits on how big of a mandate I think he has, but he did win the popular vote. So it's different. And I think he feels that way. And I think he's already kind of learned the levers of power during his first term in a way that he didn't necessarily walk into it with, sort of, I think things to keep an eye out for are recess appointments,
Mm-hmm.
also appointments of czars, not actually Senate confirmed individuals,
Right.
and
And
acting
people who are acting.
secretaries.
Yeah. Which he did.
Exactly.
Yeah, and let me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like I think that's one thing. It's I did so many of these like tabletop exercises with very smart people, and it would always not always, but it felt like a lot of times like, oh well, he wouldn't do that, he couldn't do that. Oh, like so much of the stuff we're already worried about, Abby, he already did on a
Hmm.
smaller scale in the summer of 2020 in the wake of George Floyd and all of the protests we saw there, and night after night in places like Portland, Oregon, right? Like he sent federal officers into a place like Portland on the authority of Chad Wolf, who was the acting secretary of DHS. I think he'd been like the assistant secretary for public affairs or something, right? Like he
Yeah.
was not,
Hmm.
he was like a press guy, right?
Hmm.
And so like so much of what people are worried about, we've seen on a smaller scale. Like he's already separated families at the border, right? Like that's not
Right.
new news. He had
Right.
the authority to do it then, he'll have the authority to do it now. And that's one thing is, and I say this for all of my activist friends, if it makes you feel better to say that Donald Trump didn't get 50% of the popular vote, right? He didn't get more than half the country. Okay, great. But let's be clear. The last time he won the popular vote, I had hair on my head and I worked for the candidate that did it, George W. Bush. So, like, what I'm asking for is folks to reserve their energy and conserve their energy to Abby's earlier point about what matters, right? Like, if he goes out and says he has a mandate, like you screaming, no, you don't, doesn't do any good because you know what? He doesn't care. He could have
Yeah.
lost the popular vote and he would have said he had a mandate, right? Like it doesn't matter because
Exactly.
he's crazy, right? He is a malignant narcissist. At the moment the word comes out of his mouth, he believes it to be true, whether it has any bearing on reality. And so
Hmm.
that's my thing is like, guys, as we get closer, we're 5, 6 weeks now to in the inaugural. I'm not saying like if you want to stand up, but understand like why are you doing it? Because if it's just more rage and anger, right, that you are spewing out into the ether to no effect, then I would ask you for your own well-being before anybody else's. Like, is this good for you? And is this going to help us do the work necessary to mitigate the things that he wants to do? And frankly, we should not sleep, Abby, on the states that MAGA controls, right?
Right. Hmm.
Most of the old Confederacy, most of the Midwest, most of the Mountain West, right? Like, oh, we'll be okay here because Joe Biden might pardon all these people. Okay, you don't think there's an attorney general in some deep red state who wouldn't put a case on somebody if the White House called and asked him to? He'd do it in a heartbeat,
Right.
right? And
Right.
so that's the other part too. Is like my continual failure over all this time, Abby, has been a lack of imagination. Nothing should surprise us, gang. Nothing, right?
Yeah.
If it's not as bad as we thought it would be, I can only hope for that. I don't even know what that means. If it's worse, how could you tell? Right? Like these people have no compunction. It's power, money, fame, whatever it is, and the consolidation of those things. Like there's no, I mean, like, yeah, okay, Leonard Leo wanted as you and I were talking the other day, like he wanted a majority of conservatives on the Supreme Court. He got it, right?
Mhm.
Probably going to get another one at this point, right? And so now you're not going to be 6-3, you're going to be 7-2. Well, if I'm the Democratic Party, I'm like, how the hell do I go win back some states, right, that I lost that allowed a Senate to drift so far so fast, right, that like I never get past 51. I never get past
Right.
52, right? Because that's the other thing is you can complain about the game, but the rules of the game are clear and have been for a long, long time, right? Like these
Hmm.
aren't new rules. The
Right.
formation of the United States Senate and how it works is not new. That's not a
Hmm.
new thing. The Electoral College, not a new thing. The makeup of how the
Right.
U.S. House operates, not a new thing. How states conduct elections in the Constitution. And I'm sorry to lecture, I'm sorry to rant, Abby, but it's just one of those things where, to your point about like, don't, the signal and the noise, there's a whole hell of a lot of noise, right? Figure out what your signal is and then go transmit that as opposed to just being more of the, can you believe X? Well, yeah, I can. And everybody else
Right.
can too, right?
Right. Yes. We've seen this show before. So
Right.
I think, you know, I stay focused on like what is actually happening, what's actually occurring. To your point, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level as well. And try to tune things out in a way that like you can actually really pay attention to kind of like where things are really moving and
Right.
in troubling directions.
Yes, listen, as I remind myself, I do not need to say everything that comes into my head on social media. I am trying my best not to do that. I try to say the things I think matter or are thought provoking or even maybe make somebody angry, but at least get them to consider an alternative point of view in these crazy times we are in. All right, Abby, before I let you go, where can our folks find you online?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram at Abby Tracy and I'm on Twitter X at Abigail Tracy.
All right. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter and TikTok and Blue Sky and says us at Reed Galen, on Instagram and threads at Reed_Galen USA, on Substack at the home front. I hope you'll check it out. And guys, go to jointheunion.us. We have much work to be done. We are working on it now. And if you would, throw us a couple of bucks, smash that donate button at jointheunion.us. Help us out a little bit. Everybody, thanks so much for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks.